Well, let's get started then. My name is Alan Story. I'm from GetPRDone, and I'm going to be chairing the meeting tonight and interviewing our guest, Neil Lawson. And we also have a special guest, Duncan Brack, but he comes later. As you know, GetPRDone has only really one objective, one goal for the moment. It's to campaign for the Labour Party to endorse a proportional representation voting system. Now, let's just say that happens, for example, in September 2021. Well, that would be a tremendous step forward. Many of us are working for this goal. Lots of people on this call, we sort of work night and day. But then what happens after that? Well, that doesn't get us PR just because the Labour Party supports it. They'll then have to go to an election, getting ready for an election. And we can assume that Boris Johnson, the Tories, will not bring in PR. I think that's a pretty safe bet. And so then the question is, well, would a Labour Party do that? Would a Labour Party bring in PR? How would you get a Labour Party into power to be able to do that? Well, I mean, the numbers are not looking very good for Labour. And moreover, there's numbers of that we have to be like 140, 150 seats won by Labour. And that is a very tough ask, a bigger swing than has ever been recorded. So how can we beat the Tories? One version would be by tactical voting. And we saw that last week, down in Buckinghamshire. That was a sort of tactical voting from below, where people decided, well, it looks like the Lib Dem is going to win, and so we're in fact going to put our vote in the Lib Dem category. But there has been before us a very coordinated tactical voting scheme, and one that was very successful, and that was in the 1997 general election. And it was called the Ashdown, after Paddy Ashdown, Blair Project, to in fact defeat the Tories. So now our guest tonight is Neil Lawson, who's a director of Compass. People know Compass. Do you call yourself a think tank? Is that organizers, whatever, Neil? We called you back in the 1990s as a backroom boy. Just tell us exactly what did you do in the Labour Party in the mid to late 90s for Gordon Brown, for the Labour Party? What was your role there?
Well, firstly, Alan, thanks for inviting me on. And I'd just like to pay tribute to what GetPRDone have been doing. I think it's really essential that there's a body of people who are outside of the parties who are agitating more forcefully for PR, because if we just do it on the inside and play it all nicely, we may not get the outcome we want. We need an outside organisation that's a little bit kind of tougher. And that's the role I see GetPRDone playing. I think it's vital, and more power to your elbow. In terms of what I was doing in the 1990s, I know I barely look old enough to be a political operator in the 1990s. But I'd been an advisor to Gordon Brown. I always say I was an advisor to Gordon Brown, but he never took my advice in the early 90s. I then left to work in the private sector, but I'd always kept him heavily involved in centre and centre-left politics through an organisation called the Labour Coordinating Committee, and through a journal that I'd helped set up, which is still around today, called Renewal. And in all of those organisations, I'd been always a pluralist. I'd always looked out from the Labour Party and forged relationships with others. In particular, the Green Party then, you have to remember, was very small, but the Liberal Democrats were much bigger. And I always had strong relationships with Liberal Democrats. In particular, a guy called Neil Sherlock. We wrote a book together in the run-up to the 97 election called The Progressive Century, trying to trial ideas, thoughts, and make connections about how Labour and Liberal Democrats could work together. So I was a kind of backroom fixer, but thinker and organiser that was keen to try and do something to unite centre and centre-left forces in the run-up to the 97 election. So working around think tanks, journals, etc., trying to build writing books about the ideas which could underpin this potential progressive century. Maybe we'll come back to that, because I've still got 79 years, Alan, to make it a progressive century.
Right.
So I haven't given up yet.
Right. Now, listen, just before we do get to the 1997 election, paint a little picture of us of what were politics like, as there'd been almost not quite 20 years of Tory rule, Thatcher and then Major. There was only three parties, the Lib Dems, Tories, and Labour. How were things different than they are today, as we start to say, well, tactical voting, like what were the conditions different?
Well, in some respects, it was the same, in the sense that we'd been working off of lots of Conservative victories, in that case since 1979, in this case since 2010, but they've been packing them in a bit faster in the last 10, 11 years than they did over the long, big victories of Thatcherism and then Major in 92. And the thing about the 92 election was that was the real blow to the Labour Party, because it had fought its way back from 87, where it kind of re-established itself, built up again. And the huge hope was that 92, after Thatcher had gone and Major had come in, that this was going to be the big turning point. And 92 was a kind of blow to the solar plexus of the Labour Party. That after that, it was, okay, what do we have to do to win? And I think the confidence had been, in many respects, knocked out of the Labour Party, not just through that election defeat, but through the Labour movement, through the defeats of the miners in the 80s, the defeat of the print workers in Wapping, a number of things about local authorities in Sheffield and Liverpool being defeated. These were years and more than a decade, 18 years of utter defeat and demoralisation for the left. So that by the time you get to the run up to 97, John Smith unfortunately died. Blair comes in, and by the time Blair comes in, it's kind of the Labour Party's, well, whatever do you want? He won a big mandate to lead the party, and not only did he win a mandate, he won the freedom to do whatever he wanted to do. Effectively changed the Labour Party from being the Labour Party to being New Labour, to getting rid of Clause 4, to changing policy and position after policy and position. But one element of that was an openness on his behalf to relationships with the Liberal Democrats and Paddy Ashdown in particular. Right. So the overriding kind of context of this is bitter defeat and utter determination to win next time in any way, at any price, in any way that we can. And one of the key differences between now and then is that defeat and that determination led to an absolutely driving central control over everything the party did. So the leader's office was completely in control of the whole of the party, all of the candidates, all of the MPs. Everyone did what they said, and the centre commanded and controlled everything. Right. So hopefully that gives the listeners a bit of a picture of what it was like then, and we'll begin to contrast that and a bit more to what the circumstances are now.
Okay, that's very helpful, Neil. Now, why did Blair and Ashdown enter into this semi-secret deal? I mean, what was the calculation that was made? I mean, Labour was ahead in the polls, it was looking good, but Blair obviously felt what?
Nervous. He felt nervous. I reread, and we're going to hear from Duncan in a bit. I reread Duncan's chapter in the book, The Alternative, where he recounts this very well. And he quotes a brilliant backroom boy of the time called Neil Lawson, who said that New Labour were like gate crashers at a party. So even though that they were 20% ahead in the polls and steaming towards victory, because of because of 92 and that experience of thinking you were going to win then and losing at the last minute, it was as if they were still on a knife edge, as if everything was to play, that you couldn't give up until you were kind of miles and miles and miles over the line, because otherwise we could fall on our face again, and lose again. So there was this kind of nervousness that every stone had to be overturned, that everything had to be got right, controlled, centralized, put in place all the elements, I mean, what was quite an amazing political operation. So Blair, so there was two things driving this for Blair. One, a nervousness that even if Labour were going to win, it was only going to win by a narrow majority and would need support of a centre party, particularly because despite the fact that he overwhelmingly had been won the election as leader, there was still a large group in the Labour Party that weren't Blairites and MPs who weren't Blairites, and he didn't want to have to be beholden to that group within a narrow victory in Westminster in the PLP. So he'd rather have a relationship with a block of Liberal Democrats who he could use, to outvote any problematic people on his left. So I think there were those two big political reasons, and then a very personal one that they got on very well. They were similar in some respects. They liked each other's company. They spent quite a lot of time together. I know they had dinners with their wives as a couple. So they got on. They also shared a relationship with Roy Jenkins, who, as Duncan points out, was a mentor to Tony Blair. Roy Jenkins, the ex-Labour frontbencher, reforming minister in the 60s, who brought in all of those great social reforms. It's since gone away to Europe and come back again and formed with the formation of the SDP and then folded into the Liberal Democrats. Jenkins was a mentor to both of them. So there were kind of lots of relationships and lots of ties and lots of political imperatives that pushed them towards talking together and working together.
That's really quite different than 2021 Britain, isn't it, Neil? Gee. Okay, now let's sort of get into the nuts and bolts of this. How did this deal of tactical voting, work in practice? Because Duncan's article is very interesting, I agree, and we're going to hear from Duncan in a few minutes here. But exactly, was it very top down? They sat around and said, okay, you get Sheffield North, you get Sheffield South, la, 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 la. Was it kind of a division? How did the thing work? Did the party's supporters go along with this? Did people say, because it is quite a big ask, we're going to get to that in a few minutes, don't vote for who the party you want, vote for the party sort of we tell you to vote for. So how did the system work?
It happened because myself and my kind of fellow operative in the Liberal Democrats, a guy called Neil Sherlock, who I've already mentioned, organised a dinner in a hotel in central London, to which we invited Chris Renard, who was the campaign chief of the Liberal Democrats, and Peter Mandelson, who was the campaign chief of the Labour Party. And over the dinner, we talked about the kind of, the differences and the similarities and whatever. And then towards the end of the evening, push come to shove and the crunch came. And Peter Mandelson said, well, look, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to organise this in terms of seats? And so this was quite near to the 97 election. And Chris Renard pulled a sheet out of his jacket pocket with a list of target Liberal Democrat seats, which was taken by Peter Mandelson, who then put his pen through, his very nice ink pen, through a few of them, and took it away and said, let me work on this. Mandelson took the list away. Then a few days, a week later, a list appears in the Daily Mirror of target seats telling people where they should vote Liberal Democrat and where they should vote Labour. And that became the template. So remember, no websites, no tactical voting sites, etc. Just a mass circulation paper telling people that in these places, if you want to get the Tories out, these are the parties that you should vote for in that instance. So that people knew how to vote tactically, and then the lists were used internally by the two parties to ensure that, yes, they would stand candidates. We'll go on to Tatton maybe in a bit, but across the whole country, they stood candidates, but they were paper candidates. The parties didn't put any resources into the place, or Labour didn't put any resources into the places where the Liberal Democrats were the main challenger, and the Liberal Democrats didn't put any effort into the seats where Labour was the main challenger. And that had that suggestion, that signalling of who to vote for, and that commitment not to campaign had a big impact. It probably swung another sort of 40 or 50 seats away from the Conservatives.
Right. So there was no like stand asides. Labor ran everywhere. Well, not in Northern Ireland, and Liberal Democrats ran, again, sort of everywhere. But it wasn't like the Liberal Democrats that were not running in 50 constituencies or anything like that.
There was only one stand aside. The only place there was an agreed stand aside where both the Liberal Democrats and Labour agreed not to stand a candidate was in Tatton against a sitting Conservative MP called Neil Hamilton, who had been hauled across the coals for sleaze, for cash for questions.
Right.
So they used this one seat as a kind of emblem of Tory sleaze.
Right.
And they said, neither of us are going to stand a candidate there. And the candidate who stood was an independent called Martin Bell, who'd been a BBC journalist who had been campaigning around the sleaze issue. Now, that's important, not just because it showed that, that worked and Martin Bell was duly elected to represent Tatton, but it puts a lie to the fact that Labour can't stand a candidate. They have done it. If they have done it once, they can do it again. I'm not saying they will do it again or they should do it again. We can get into the complexities of stand asides if we want to, but it has been done. So therefore, it can be done again.
Right. So 97, how many people sort of knew about this? I mean, there was the Daily Mirror, and did people sort of know quite broadly about this in circles, in a particular kind of seat? In this seat here we vote Labour, in this seat here we vote. Was that really quite common knowledge?
It was very widely advertised and widely known, and then obviously the party hierarchies and machines duly directed their resources in the places that they knew they could do most damage and not least damage to the best placed progressive party. So it did have an impact, but remember as well that it wasn't just about the mechanics of tactical voting and tactical campaigning. There'd been, Blair and Ashdown were seen together. People knew that they got on. Duncan recounts, other kind of policy initiatives which created the environment in which Labour and Liberal Democrats were seen together. Robin Cook and Robert McLennan worked on a kind of new democratic settlement, which both parties shared. Their campaign teams kind of, shared grids during the election campaign so that they wouldn't cut across each other. Right. There was very little attack by Labour on the Liberal Democrats and vice versa, and a reasonable amount of concerted attacks on the Conservative Party. So the two things that we should take from this is that you need the signals from the leadership about why tactical voting and campaigning is right, and then you need structures. In that day, the structure was the Daily Mirror. Today, as we may get onto, there are different structures which we need to put in place to allow tactical campaigning and tactical voting to happen.
Right. Now, in his book, Duncan says, he quotes John Curtis saying that Labour gained 15 to 21 seats and the Lib Dems 10 to 14. Do you think that's accurate?
I have no idea. Let's bring Duncan in a bit to kind of, if he's got any kind of background on that. I mean, you need quite sophisticated post, voting polling to be able to work out exactly. The same thing was true with the work that we did in the 2017 election around the Progressive Alliance. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the figures, but there was, there was a palpable mood of time for change in the country in '97. Right. And people knew where and how to vote if they wanted to make that a time for change question.
And there wasn't a pushback from voters. I've been voting Labour my life. I'm not going to vote for one of those bloody Liberal Democrats.
Well, no, because it had been signalled, because they weren't so different. They had some policy differences, but there was a big overlap in terms of policy. As I say, Ashdown and Blair seemed to get on very well. So this wasn't a kind of contradictory, kind of, tension-filled relationship. We can begin to contrast that to today in a bit if you want to. Yeah. So it was kind of a tired 18 years of Tory rule. They were washed up and sleazy. Here were these newer, fresh-faced people who largely agreed with each other. Frankly, what's not to like? No one, there weren't any, apart from Tatton, there weren't any stand-asides. People were free to vote however they wanted. There was a Liberal Democrat and a Labour person on every ballot paper. They could vote how they wanted to. But in key marginals, where you don't need to move that many voters, you only need to pick up a few who are going to vote tactically to make a difference. And I think what both the signals did and what the kind of focus of the campaigning did was move enough of them. Now, today, we've got much more sophisticated ability to move more people in terms of tactical voting, much greater awareness. We saw that, as you said, in Cheshire and Amersham, quite amazing levels of tactical voting. And what seems to be, becoming true again is that Labour people are willing to back Liberal Democrats increasingly, and let's see if Liberal Democrats are beginning to support Labour again. And it's certainly the case from people I spoke to in Cheshire and Amersham that, like 97, soft Tories can start to vote for the Liberal Democrats, half knowing that that might lead to a Labour Prime Minister, because the fear factor of Corbyn, and I don't want to get into the politics of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the fear factor of Corbyn has been taken out and we've got Starmer here. As a question, one of the political questions for me out of all of this is that worked in 97, and even, lots more Conservatives were switching straight from the Tory party over to Labour, or they were voting for Liberal Democrat. And the problem with that is, partly that, you then get a government that isn't prepared to be radical enough, that then starts sowing up the seeds of the problems that we now face. And I want a progressive alliance, and PR, which still retains a radical edge so that we can deal with the problems of inequality, climate, etc., and doesn't fudge them. And famously, as New Labour fudged the issue of PR and let everyone down by not implementing it because it wasn't radical enough. And the other big question in all of this, Alan, is that everything I've described was a top-down initiative, a deal struck at the top, relationships at the top, which created the conditions in all of this. We need that, but there was not a movement for PR or a movement for something like a progressive alliance. So that as soon as the election was over, there was no pressure to actually kind of enact what they had promised. And so, partly it was because Labour won such a huge majority, but also because none of the activists knew, none of the MPs knew about it, none of the think tanks, none of the voters. So this time we have to build a movement for PR and for a progressive alliance if we want to make sure that happens the other side of an election and the parties aren't allowed to renege, particularly on PR.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Duncan now. Duncan, what other facts do you think were important about 97, that tactical voting deal? And Neil has already drawn a few lessons from that. What lessons would you draw? But any other particular facts of importance and your own lessons about this question, like of openness or close? Talk to us for a few minutes.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me along here. I wasn't quite expecting to give a talk, but I'm happy to try and answer questions. I think, I agree pretty much with everything Neil said, except that I think there was a bit more of a progressive alliance kind of atmosphere than you perhaps give credit for. And I think the Cook-McLennan talks and the paper that was published there in early 97 was quite important, and they focused on constitutional reform. And if you look at the package of proposals they came out with, including incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, freedom of information legislation, devolution of Scotland and Wales, elected authority for London, removal of the hereditary peers from the Lords, PR for the European elections, and then the referendum on voting reform for Westminster elections. So actually everything apart from that last one was done. And I think those talks, there was nothing there that was new for the Lib Dems, but there was a fair amount of stuff I think that was new for Labour, or at least some of Labour, and I think it at least helped to reinforce the position of the constitutional modernisers within the Labour Party. So that was important, but that was part of, Neil mentioned this anyway, it was part of a broader sort of series of things happening over the previous 3 years running up to the election that led to, that created the impression that the parties were separate, Labour and the Liberal Democrats. They weren't in an alliance, they were different, they fought each other. Lib Dems won the Little-Roan Saddleworth by-election from a strong Labour challenge. But they were increasingly different from the Conservative government, and they were more alike to each other than they were to the Tories. Right. And that was a result of things, agreements to focus their attacks on the Tories and not on each other, agreements to cooperate sometimes in Parliament and parliamentary questions. There's the Cook-McLennan talks, all of those things. There was Blair and Ashdown, as Neil said, obviously get on with each other. So there were bits of it that were sort of public or semi-public, and I think that really helped create the impression that the Conservative government was an increasingly beleaguered minority, and it was just out of touch with
Right.
what majority people thought in the country.
Right, right. And now your lessons here about, in your article, which I found very interesting. That's why we're having this talk, by the way, because I read this article from Mark Peck's and from your chapter. This question of I find this quite interesting. Either be completely open or be completely closed. Talk about that.
So I think there are, yes, I mean, the one I've just talked about, particularly the Cook-McLennan talks, were obviously public. All the stuff that Neil talked about, the agreements to not target each other's target seats, to encourage the Mirror to publish the list of Lib Dem target seats. Incidentally, they published a list of 22 seats, where if Labour voters were to vote Lib Dem, then the Lib Dems would win, and the Lib Dems won 20 of them in the end. So, that clearly had an effect. And the Curtis and Steed conclusion, based on the British election study, that there was an unprecedented degree of tactical voting in the election. So, I mean, you want to create an atmosphere, as I said, of kind of pre-election cooperation. The Tories are the enemy, not each other. That's important. Right. But I think if you start to get into very overt forms of cooperation, and an electoral pact withdrawing candidates is the most extreme form of that, I think there are big dangers in there. And that was supported by opinion polling that the Lib Dems did in Lib Dem target seats in the run-up to 97, which they polled particularly Tory voters from 92, finding out how prepared they were to switch to the Lib Dems, and they were quite open to it, and the government got more and more unpopular, so they got more and more open to it. But if there was a suggestion that Labour and the Liberal Democrats were cooperating in advance, were kind of ganging up on the Tories, that was worrying enough of these voters to scare quite a big proportion of them back to the Conservatives. Because you can't assume, I suspect everyone on this call probably is anti-Tory, and probably we would be prepared to vote Labour or Lib Dem. Maybe not everyone would, but in the seat to defeat the Tory candidate. But that isn't true of the general population.
No.
There are a lot of Lib Dem voters who will not vote Labour. I think there are probably less of them now that Corbyn is not leader, but nevertheless, you can't assume that if there isn't a Lib Dem candidate, some of them won't go to the Conservatives. And there are obviously Labour voters who won't vote Lib Dem. Probably they wouldn't vote Tory instead of Lib Dem. They might vote Green, or they might abstain, or something like that. But you can't just assume you can move blocks of voters around in the way you want. And I think there's a test there in the last election, 2019, of the Unite to Remain alliance, including the Lib Dems, Greens, and Plaid. I haven't seen a study of that, the impact of that on all three parties, but I know that John Curtis has estimated that it was of no benefit whatsoever to Liberal Democrat candidates in the seats where Greens and Plaid Cymru stood down. So I just think you can't assume that an electoral pact, A, will have any positive benefits, positive outcomes, and B, that it won't have actually negative outcomes. So I think actually promoting tactical voting is a much more sensible way to go about it.
Right.
If I can come in, Alan, I completely agree with that. I'm very nervous about stand aside. And if they happen, they certainly shouldn't happen by being imposed from central office on places. If local parties, progressive centre-left parties, want to get together locally and do things, and work together to the extent of standing aside, maybe even through an open primary, I think all the parties should have the right to do that. It should be open, it should be transparent, and if that works, it should be done. But the other, it's not just that it looks like it's a fix, and to some degrees it is a fix. It's also because it doesn't always work. You can go around a lot of seats and work out that it's really helpful for the Liberal Democrat or Labour candidate if the other side stand, because they soak up votes from mostly from the Tories, but from other players. So you go to Canterbury, which Labour held, they were delighted that there was a Liberal Democrat candidate on the ballot, because quite a lot of soft Tories voted Liberal Democrat and therefore didn't vote Conservative. So it's this idea that there's a kind of one size fits all, a national agreement to stand down in favour of each other. Well, A, it's not likely, because the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats aren't going to do it. And B, it's probably not helpful either. What really matters is sending the signals of broad trust, of broad time for a change, of signalling to people that you're going to get a new government and then it's going to work effectively for you. and then operating the structures which enable as much smart voting and smart campaigning as possible. That's the position we need to get to in 2000 and whenever it's going to be, autumn 22 even, or spring 23, whenever it's going to be. And the other point, just listening to Duncan, you're right, Duncan. There was some activity, but even to the level it was Robin Cook and McClellan talking, there was very little underneath that. At the top, there was quite a lot, and the reason that matters is that even after when Blair got his landslide, he still wanted to hold the door open to introduce some Liberal Democrats into his cabinet and offer them jobs, and he couldn't do that because there was not support in the rest of the shadow cabinet, now cabinet, or the PLP for that, because everything had been focused really on his relationship with Ashdown, and he hadn't brought Jack Straw, Gordon Brown, John Prescott, etc., with him. So somehow we have to engineer kind of relationships across the board next time, so that the fit is natural and works. Whatever it's going to be, it might be a coalition government, it might be Labour-led with Liberal Democrat, Green, and whatever else support. But it needs to be organic, it needs to be authentic, and it needs to be deep. Unlike that kind of relatively top-down, shallow, but mechanistically effective alliance that happened in '97.
Can I just ask one last question before people jump in? I'm finding this really fascinating. We're now in, we'll say, August 2022. It's looking like there might be an election. Would it be, who knows who's going to be head of the leader of the Labour Party at that time, but let's just say Stammer's still hanging on there, and Ed Davey would obviously, or would likely still be leader of the Liberal Democrats. Can you see a scenario when you would have a dinner with the chief fixer for Stammer, the chief fixer for Davey, and come up with a list of, well, the problem is, of course, the scale of the tactical voting for Labour to win is so much bigger in 2022 than it is in 1997. But can you see the political culture today sort of allowing, say, these are the seats that are Labour, these are the seats that are Lib Dem? Can you see that political culture allowing it today within the two parties?
Is Neil going to go first?
No, go on, you go first, Duncan.
I think in the Lib Dems, interesting question. I can see some other Lib Dems on the call, so they might want to express their own views. I would have thought the party is open to that. The issue of some kind of alliance or cooperation or whatever is quite a live topic for debate within the Lib Dems. It came up all the time in the leadership election last year. And probably Layla Moran was slightly more favourable towards it than Ed Davey, but neither of them were against it. And the way in which the electorate seems to be dividing now, I think probably supports the argument for more tactical voting, in that you seem to have a more Remain voting, highly educated, more affluent set of electors who are really getting pissed off with the Tory government. And I think we saw that in Cheshire and Amersham. In most of the seats, no, not all of them, but in many of the seats where that's the case, the Lib Dems are clearly better placed to win than Labour. Some cases it's Labour. Whereas in the north and in the more Leave voting, more deprived, less well-educated, less affluent seats, it is still primarily a Tory-Labour battle, and the Lib Dems are only really there in a few seats. So I mean, there aren't many Labour Lib Dem battlegrounds. I think the practical scope for tactical voting is still there. I think it would be good if things like the Mirror or other publications did promote the idea, because I think that reaches far more people than tactical voting websites or tweets or things you have to sign up to. I think it gets at people who probably haven't thought about tactical voting in advance.
Right. Neil, jump in.
Yeah, I think we do live, thankfully, in a different era. I think people have information at their fingertips. I think they're kind of better at self-actualizing. I think they're better at working out what's in their interest. I think, they're not as ready to take kind of deferential orders from the top, and these are all good things. I think the Labour Party is not the Labour Party it was in '97. I think you just look at the kind of, the sweep of constituencies that are passing resolutions for proportional representation, which gives you an indication of the mood within the Labour Party for PR. And obviously, you've got to be a bit of a fool if you think you're going to pass PR and then not have multi-party politics and have to work with other people. So people are on that journey, lots of them in the Labour Party. So that's a good thing. And I just think the world out there is complex and volatile. And I don't think this is going to be done like generals in the First World War, moving their troops on some kind of, map. It's going to be done much more as we describe it, as a rebel alliance of people deciding themselves. They don't have to wait for, Liberal Democrat or Labour central office to tell them what's going on in their area, their county or their region. They know, and we're all going to make sure they know, and they're already talking anyway about this stuff. I think the activists and the voters are way ahead of the leaders in terms of knowing what's got to be done and how it could be done. But we have to kind of put the right structures in place to begin to make that work effectively. Look, it would be madness if even in private, under the radar, the staffers for the leader of the two parties and the three parties now, because the Greens matter a lot. We've left them out of the conversation because they weren't part really of the equation in '97. They are, thankfully, much more part of the equation now, both in terms of numbers and presence, etc. That if the three parties don't kind of begin to talk together and work some of that through, it's troubling, it's difficult, but it's the only way that we're going to get change. So I think that has to happen. It will happen, but it shouldn't be the centre dictating to the rest of the country what's good for them or what's right. I think much more importantly, we build this one up this time from the grassroots. The top need to send the signals and help, but actually this is going to be a rebel alliance, not a Death Star.
Okay, I think we've had a good first 40 minutes or so. So Matt, over to you. You're the question master. What's the list of questions that are coming up, both for Neil and for Duncan?
Okay, so we haven't had many questions actually. In fact, if you'd like to ask yours, please, first. If you could come off mute and ask.
What was that, Matt?
M, short for Emma.
Oh, Emma. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I was just curious to gauge the speaker's views on the current Labour Party and whether they have an idea of whether there is a willingness to cooperate in the way that Blair-Ashdown did, or whether there's still this belief that actually Labour's going to win with first past the post system.
Shall I take that one, Duncan, given it's my party? But do obviously chip in with a kind of, your usual informed outside view. Well, I've already said that I think that there's a kind of groundswell around PR, which is incredibly welcome. And I think that's, that's partly, I don't know, that's driven by, as Mary Southcott's on the call. Mary's been one of the, the biggest, the best campaigners for PR in the Labour Party for a long time. I won't say how long. But as she knows, support for PR can go up when Labour's in the doldrums, when it doesn't look like it can win. And then if it looks like it's going to win, then support for PR begins to diminish. What we've seen, certainly I would say, Mary, over the last 5 years, or perhaps more, is that the sort of stable bottom line trend for support for PR, regardless of where we are in the electoral cycle or where we are in the polls, has shifted up and up. And the more you go to the activists and the members, the more support for that, for PR there is. The more you go to the centre and the machine, probably the less support there is. Now, clearly, there's different levels of power in all of that. But there's undoubtedly, I've never seen an upsurge in support for PR, like this. That doesn't mean to say that come the conference, the party will back it. And even if it does back it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the machine will allow that to take its rightful priority place in a manifesto, and a campaign. But we have to keep working on that, not just to get it through party conference, but then make sure it is used as a priority and as part of the kind of, as I see it, two sides of the same coin of PR and a progressive alliance, because the only way we're going to get a change of government to implement a PR legislation is through a progressive alliance. And the very fact that Labour-backed PR allows that progressive alliance in the kind of loose form that we discussed tonight to shake shape, because the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are incentivised to work cooperatively with Labour, because it knows that they will enact PR if we can get a copper bottom guarantee that that's going to happen. The problem for Labour is that it's never quite in the right spot, because it's either thinks it's too strong and can win without a progressive alliance, or it feels too weak that it feels like a loser if it admits that it needs a progressive alliance. And so we can't just wait around for the fate of the country and eternal one-party rule by the Conservatives just because Labour can't be exactly in the right sweet spot at the right time. We have to win the argument. We have to win the case for PR and the multi-party, plural politics that go with that. And I think that's in the 21st century, politics is about negotiated futures and not imposed futures. And I think this is part of the zeitgeist. It opens up incredible opportunities for a flourishing of a deeper democracy, to the new politics for the new society we want. I think we can get people in the Labour Party behind that, not just in a sullen, we can't win any other way, it's a coalition of losers, but in a really exciting way that kind of recognises that the only way we reform the NHS, the only way that we deliver good jobs, the only way that we tackle climate change is through a deeper democracy, which PR is the linchpin of, which begins to unlock a whole load of other kind of devolution and House of Lords and et cetera, written constitution, and right into the economy, into society. Our only answer ever to everything is deeper democracy. And this opens up that space. So we shouldn't be defensive, we shouldn't be reactive, we should be absolutely positive that for Labour, this is its route to transformative politics.
Okay.
So I think, can I come in there actually? So I think if Labour does commit to PR, that will make it much easier to do everything else and will help those of us in the Lib Dems who would like to see closer cooperation make that strengthen that argument for that. And I do think, I agree with what Neil was saying earlier about the sort of impetus for tactical voting coming best at the local level. But it is important to try and create that atmosphere of cooperation at the centre, and that has to be done at the centre, I think. So if you see, Ed Davey and Keir Starmer agreeing on issues like PR, other constitutional issues around corruption, there are loads of things we can agree on. I think it helps to create that impression that these two parties are closer together than they are to the Tories, and therefore improves the chance of people tactically voting for each other. I think I think that'll do.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Matt, next question.
Okay, Keith, please. Do you want to ask yours? Because it does link in.
Oh, sorry, was that me you're asking, Keith Sharp?
Yeah, Keith Sharp.
Okay, thank you. I'm a Liberal Democrat. I'm heavily involved in Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform. And we've been talking in discussions today about actually something that both Neil and Duncan have touched on. I'd be interested in the view. We were saying that in '97, the Progressive Alliance consisted fundamentally of constitutional reforms, which Duncan summarised very well under Cook-McLennan. What might any Progressive Alliance programme consist of this time round? I certainly take the point that electoral reform, constitutional reform, has to be in the public eye so that there is credibility and impetus for it after a general election, where hopefully the Tories lose their majority. But is that sufficient, or are there elements of a Progressive Alliance agenda that need to be looked at? Thank you.
I've been writing about this. It's in the Guardian piece I've got today, and in a bigger report. If you go to the Compass website, there's a report handily called "All You Need to Know About a Progressive Alliance." And I address this issue, Keith, because clearly there's quite a lot of push for this being a democratic alliance, of it being just about PR, because that, and I understand the case for that, it's simple and it's straightforward. We get the three parties to agree to PR. They stand on a platform at the next election and go, vote for us, we'll get PR, we'll dissolve the government after 6 months and then hold another election under PR where it's all fair and dandy and we go into a new politics. I can completely see the logic for that. And if we do it, then we will be absolutely and completely destroyed. I remember another election recently where parties tried to define the single issue for that general election and impose a single issue on the whole country and say it's about this one constitutional issue. That was the last election, 2019, where we said it was all about Brexit. And people will not have it. A general election cannot, a single issue cannot be imposed on the people. The people decide what a general election is about. And for most people, a general election is about, who's going to govern the country and am I going to get a job? Is the NHS going to work? Is the economy going to be good? Is the education going to work? Et cetera, et cetera. Now climate change. So if we try and do this on the single issue of PR, I think we will be destroyed. Remember what they've, how good the Tories are at effectively winning referendums. Not just the Brexit one in 2016, but the horrendous 2011 one on AV. We cannot go to the country saying that a general election is all about STV versus the D'Hondt system. They'll be putting up more pictures of babies in incubators going, we want to spend money on this, and they want to spend money on electoral systems, and that's all they care about. I think we'll get destroyed. That doesn't mean that we need all the parties to sign up to the same election manifesto. Again, that's neither desirable nor feasible because we are in different parties. We have different traditions and slightly different values and different perspectives. So we should publish our own manifestos. But as we saw in the analysis that we did in a paper after 2019, the divided, we divide, they conquer paper that the Compass put out, there was an incredible overlap between the Green Party, the Liberal Democrat and the Labour manifesto in 2019. We're already agreeing on 75% of the stuff out there. What we need to do is kind of like 97 with a bit more. We need constitutional and democratic reform. We need a kind of broad idea about how we get to net zero. And we need a broad idea about what we do to kind of alleviate inequality. And there could be some shared bold ideas, across the parties, through the think tanks, in the media, etc. It doesn't have to be written down, but a broad thing that says this is what a good society looks like. And if you vote cleverly for these three parties, you're going to get a government that will enable to do that. And it will implement PR because they've all won a mandate to do that, not via a referendum. They've won the mandate. It's in their manifesto. You might have a citizens' assembly on the exact form of PR, but the principle has been won in a general election. Let's go away and do it. So I understand the case for a single issue election around PR. I just think it would be a disaster.
Duncan.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think you absolutely don't want to go down the route of trying to negotiate joint election manifestos or programs or anything like that. I mean, quite apart from anything else, we had experience of that in the Lib Dems, or at least in the pre-Lib Dem years in the Alliance in 83 and 87, which was also, of course, a seat allocation process. And it's just incredibly painful and uses up a lot of time. And that's between two parties who are really close together. And there is some benefit in the non-Tory parties not being exact clones of each other. You want to give a spectrum of opinion to the voters. But I think there is a good case for following the Cook-McLennan model and trying to reach agreement in principle on what you might call the sort of basic ground rules of democracy and government, the respect for the rule of law, government not interfering in independent institutions like the BBC or the courts or the judiciary, government not stamping on any kind of dissent and disagreement, all the things the Tories have been doing. I think that's basically, this is the basic ground rules of how we run our politics. And I think I think that's quite apart from the fact this is all raising alarm amongst people like the voters of Chesham and Amersham. I think that's actually quite a good area for the two parties to come to some kind of agreement in principle and say, we will do this if we get the chance to do it. Just one final point. I think the other important thing about that kind of progressive alliance is that you can do it and not talk about it all the time during the election. And again, I think the 92 and 97 lessons are quite good there. In 92, Paddy ran a pretty good election campaign. I was policy director at the time, so I was seeing it from the inside. But in the last week, it began to fall apart because it looked like there was going to be a hung parliament, and Paddy started talking about what the Lib Dems would do. And it just puts people off if you start talking about negotiations and coalitions, things like that. In 97, he didn't, even though all this cooperation had been going on in the run up to 97 and was going on about that, he didn't talk about it at all. And I don't think Blair did either. It was just about, they were talking about the same issues and giving the impression of cooperation that way, rather than talking about the mechanics of how you cooperate. And that's, I think, a lesson that we can learn from now as well.
Okay, Inyang, you had a question you want to ask?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. You're jumping in. There's other people who ask questions. I'm giving you special
Excellent.
treatment here.
I'll keep it quick. I was out campaigning in Chesham and Amersham for the by-election, and one of the most interesting things that I came across was the fact that a lot of the people I was speaking to who were open to the idea of a progressive alliance turned out to be Tories. Now, we all saw the outcome of the election, and it showed that there was a massive Labour swing behind Lib Dems, but also it couldn't have been done without a massive Tory swing behind the Lib Dems. And I wonder if there's room within the Progressive Alliance for soft Tories at a higher level. So, for example, a Ken Clarke or a Dominic Grieve. Is there room for a focal point such as that to really bring soft Tories in behind the campaign?
Very good question. Neil Duncan.
That's an interesting, yeah, that's a really interesting idea, actually. I mean, yes, clearly a lot of Tory voters came over to us in Chesham and Amersham, and we probably wouldn't have won it without, well, we might have won it without it, but certainly not by some thumping majority. And that happened in 97 as well. I mean, the Tories lost a quarter of their vote. The Lib Dem vote actually in 97 actually fell, even though we doubled our number of seats, which just shows how, you know, tactical voting can convert. Obviously, the Labour vote went up quite sharply. So you do want to persuade Tory voters to come over to you. I think we have real chance of doing that in the kind of more Remain voting, more highly educated areas of the country. And I think the more that people like Clarke or Grieve or people who appeal to those kind of voters, I think probably the way to do it is to talk about the same kind of issues we've just been talking about. If you can come to some kind of agreement on how you run democracy, how you run elections, to get those kind of people saying, yes, these are real dangers and this is the way to tackle it, I think that would help as well.
Neil.
Yeah, so I think Inyang's right. You know, we need to, you know, win over the centre and centre-left needs to win over Conservative voters. The Labour Party, a lot of people in the Labour Party aren't very good at thinking about that, and we need to think about that. So yes, we need to create the space for that. It may be that it isn't done under the same brand. There could be different ways of doing it. You know, my friend just down the road, Monica Harding in Esher and Walton, you know, she's mostly needing to win. She'll squeeze the Labour vote. She mostly needs to win some Conservatives over. If it looks too progressive and too left-wing, then that might scare people away. So we need to think about I don't know the answer to all of this yet, but we need to think it through. The branding, there could be, you know, different kinds of alliances or different things. We need an ecosystem that can work. But let me just say this, that in that 97 election, which this conversation is being based around, on election day, I went up to Enfield in North London to campaign there for my mate, Stephen Twigg, who kind of, you know, the rumours were on the day that, you know, actually something interesting might happen. So a lot of us hightailed it up to Enfield. And as you may know, if you remember, you know, he beat Portillo, you know, by in an amazing kind of, you know, result. And I was walking up drives, like gravel drives with, you know, 2 Jags and a Mercedes, knocking on doors, and the families would be going, yeah, we're all Labour here. We're all for Tony Blair. And a bit of me was like, well, this is great. This is brilliant. Another bit of me thought, what is this coalition and what can it do in government if it's driven by people who've got 2 Jags and Mercedes and a long gravel path and a 6-bedroom, you know, detached house, right? And that isn't because I don't want those people to not vote Conservative. I do. but I also want a government that is going to change the world and not be hidebound by those interests. And this is why plural politics, one of the reasons why plural politics matters to me, because, I would rather, in all reality, those people voting Liberal Democrat, and in a multi-party political system, allowing the Labour Party to be more radical and to the left of that, and talking about more radical transformative politics. I'm not saying the Liberal Democrats aren't radical or transformative in their own way. They are. But as more of a left winger, I want the space for that to happen, because I think, that big tent under which, going back to that kind of analogy of Labour being nervous gate crashers, all they were worried about was that family and the cars and the detached house, not the people who really needed a Labour government, who needed their life chances to be transformed and were let down because they were always looking at that family thinking, if we lose them, we're going to lose everything. So multi-party politics under PR allows Labour to be more radical. It gives the Liberal Democrats more freedom. We've still got to negotiate and bring all that together in government, but it allows all of us to be more of what we should be and authentic to our values, rather than pretending just to get a majority under first past the post.
Okay, a few more questions, and we're going to sort of aim to wrap up about 8:15. I think it's hard for people to hang on to a Zoom call for too long.
It's hard for me, Alan.
Right, you're doing a great job. Matt, because I also have a couple of announcements. Matt, next question, please.
Okay, John Appleyard, are you okay to go? Does your question still apply about triangulation of the left?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, no camera. Yes, to what extent do you think, because, well, perhaps it came out more in retrospect that Blair triangulated the left, and all the Scottish and the Northern seats were going to be Labour anyway, and then Labour expanded into Southern seats to get the majority. And how do you think that might play out? How do you think the left factor may play out at the next election?
Sorry, can you just
jump in and add an extra question onto John's? We haven't talked about Scotland and SNP yet. And I think it's that would be really remiss of us to not talk about that in the context of PR and tactical voting.
I slightly missed. Alan, can you just sum up the first question? I'll definitely deal with Scotland because I've made a note to do that anyway.
John, why don't you let you do it again?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the Red Wall isn't what it was in 97.
Right.
And Scotland the same, even though that will largely go to the SNP, which is a good thing in many ways. But how does the left play out?
Okay.
In this election.
Do you want to go first, Duncan?
Great question for me.
Oh, I'm happy to. I've got loads to say on this.
Well, I'll just put in one thought. I think we haven't really come to terms yet with the kind of realignment of the electorate. I mean, that's because it hasn't finished yet. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Batley and Spen. But it was notable that in the local elections, even when Labour was getting hammered up in the sort of traditional Labour areas, they were still picking up some reasonably good gains in southern England, for example, around Cambridgeshire and other places. And I just wonder if the country is increasingly dividing into kind of mainly Leave type areas where the Tories have just hoovered up the UKIP and Brexit vote and are now becoming the main party, and the kind of the rest of the country, more Remain voting areas where you see Labour and the Lib Dems and the Green all competing for, and maybe soft Tories, sort of competing for sort of the same sort of people, which emphasises the need for some kind of arrangement between the parties, I think. But I mean, whether that is really a sort of done deal, or whether it's more complex than that, I'm not totally sure yet.
Thanks. Neil.
Okay, on Scotland, we've got to deal with this because it ain't going away. If you remember 2015 general election, Ed Miliband in Salmon's pocket, that's coming back again. There is not going to be a change of government away from the Conservatives without the SNP. You just can't imagine, given their rock solid dominance of Scottish politics, their return of 55 MPs to Westminster. We are going to need the SNP there to be voting in some form, not as part of any kind of formal coalition, but they're going to have to be there to support some kind of change of government. And so therefore we need to talk about that, because we can ignore it and just allow the Tory spin doctors and their attack dogs in the media to say that if you vote Liberal Democrat or Labour, you're going to end up getting Nicola Sturgeon, and Britain and England's going to be run by the SNP. They are going to say it come what may. So we ought to have ourselves ready, our arguments ready, and there's some kind of understanding which kind of shows that there is a proper, grown-up, sensible relationship to be had with Scotland and the SNP about the future of the Union. I mean, my personal view is I'm ambivalent about whether Scotland stays or goes. I think that's up to the Scottish people. If there are permanent majorities in Westminster, in Holyrood for a party of independence, and I think you have to countenance a second referendum at some stage. I think that second referendum is going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen under the Conservatives. I think it can only happen under a non-Conservative government, and I think it should happen, 3 or 4 years into that government, and not around an in principle, question like Brexit, but over what would independence look like, so people knew what they were voting for. But the SNP would back a progressive alliance-style government up until that point, and then we'll see what happens. I largely think that if you had a successful progressive alliance-style government with a third option on the table about kind of maximum federal, agreement, I think that would win anyway. But we're only going to get that if we've got a progressive alliance in place. So we can't ignore Scotland. We can't stick our heads in the sand and leave it. It's going to come back to bite us, and we have to deal with it. And anyway, the SNP are broadly as easily as progressive as the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. They're virtually no different in many respects. Right. So we've got to talk about that. On the question of the Red Wall, I mean, two points really. The first thing is the Red Wall voted for a democratic revolution. It was called Brexit. They were tired of being ignored. They were given one opportunity in a referendum to shout out that they wanted sovereignty and they wanted to take back control. However wrong you think it was, however it was kind of spun and misled, this was a democratic outcry of saying that we've been ignored by our politicians for too long, and they cleverly spun it into a way for those people to vote for change. They wanted change, and like successive years of Labour-led governments hadn't done it. So there is an instinct in those places for democratic revolution and democratic renewal. How can we apply PR and other forms of devolution, and Burnham doing a great job as mayor, etc., to kind of mop up that sentiment and that desire for greater democracy and to take back control? Because that's the one place, it's the only place now the Conservatives won't go. They'll spend as much as they want, they'll build as many trains as they can, etc., and it's very hard to compete with that. They're creating jobs up on Teesside. We saw that with the mayoral elections, etc. there. We can't outspend them, but we can out-democratise them, because that's the space they'll never go. And the last point is that, to me, it's not a progressive alliance if it doesn't include the working class. If it's just a metropolitan, liberal, Remain voting, Southern vote, that is not a progressive alliance. That's just a reincarnation of the anti-Brexit vote, and that loses. It's not right as a winger, and I'm here to try and put in place the structures and the culture people can better their lives collectively. But also because electorally it just won't work. So we have to embrace these people, not with bloody flags and pints outside of pubs, but with real transformative, radical politics, democracy, real economics, real spending. I like basic services and universal basic income, the things that will start making a difference to people's lives. That's what I think we can start putting on the table.
Okay, we're going to have 2 more questions. And I just want to have Mary Southcott have a chance to jump in. She was also there, worked with the very important reformer, Robin Cook. Mary, jump in.
Okay, I saw it more from the bottom up, because in 1987, the Labour Party was a ferment for electoral reform, and that was when Robin Cook and Jeff Rooker, who subsequently took over the Labour campaign for electoral reform, backed Arthur Scargill in terms of supporting electoral reform. And it went on from there to 1993. From there on, local government was doing what some of us want the parties to do. They were sharing power. They were the laboratories for the new politics. And the lead up to the 97 election was so obvious that what was going to happen that Robin Cook said that there was going to be a landslide, and he got slapped down for saying it. I wish that Neil has said something about Gordon's role, because Gordon's having a role now. And if he's having a role now, if you agree he's having a role now, he was a bit of an impediment at that stage in terms of where he fitted into the Cook, McClellan, Ashdown, Blair sort of stuff. And I wanted to say the Observer was really, really important on the Sunday before the election. It told middle-class people where to tactically vote. And that's what happened in Bristol West, which party was going to win the Tories. And I agree, Kevin Maguire did a fantastic targeting job in the Daily Mirror in 2017. And if everybody read it, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Okay, Neil, jump in. Thanks, Mary. Jump in. Tell us the true heart of Gordon Brown on PR.
There's a reason I only worked for him for 2 years, Alan, and you can work that one out for yourself. Look, Gordon is a brilliant brain. His heart's in the right place, but it's certainly not in the place of PR. And it goes back to that thing about the Labour Party. It's called Labourism. It's that kind of notion that there is one single party and it will control the state and it will pull the levers of the state and it will kind of give things, good things to people who will be grateful and they will vote for it again. And that kind of 1945 model is gone. It's never coming back. Socialism to me has always been the socialism of helping people take power for themselves so that they can decide what they want and how they want to get it. And I think that's more true now in the 21st century, a world of networks and communication and being able to be in touch and know and organize and all the things we can now do. So, it's these big structural, technical, cultural reasons that are kind of sweeping the politics of people like Gordon Brown away, who want to kind of control everything and operate everything from the centre with good hearts, for good reason, in worthy kind of ways. But it isn't the spirit and the culture of the zeitgeist. PR is, because it opens this world up to doing things not to people, but with people. And that's the socialism we need in the 21st century. And it's a shame that people like Brown, in all their goodness and all their good intentions, are still absolutely at the centre of decision-making over things like the party's democratic position. But that's why we have to build the forces in the constituencies, but also, like GetPRDone, outside, in civil society, everywhere. And I think people in society do want to take control, they do want a voice, they do want to have a say, and they don't want to be dictated to. So a very different form of politics. If the Labour Party can't shift itself from that old mechanical top-down politics to a kind of new ecosystem, participatory, negotiated politics, it's going to keep losing. And that's why this campaign matters so much, because I don't want the Labour Party to die. I want it to be a force for good in our country, in our society, but it's only going to be that. It's a force for deeper democracy.
Okay, I'd like to just wrap up by making two announcements. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Neil and Duncan. We should have had you on the billing at the beginning, Duncan, but that's all right. Really, I found it really, really fascinating, very contemporary, many things, many more questions, of course, to ask.